We're joined by Narayan Pant, Affiliate Professor of Strategy and former Dean of Executive Education. What are companies telling you as to how they're handling the human capital issue in Asia?
I think the big thing they're all concerned about, interestingly, is that this crisis is going to be short. So if you think about most companies that have been operating in Asia, they've been operating on the principle that talent is scarce, and the only limit to profitable growth is talent. Right? That's been the principle in which they've operated. Now, along comes this crisis, and the knee-jerk reaction of a lot of companies is, well, we've got to manage costs, we've got to, control our headcount costs, which are the biggest costs that, many of them have to manage. But for a lot of chief executives, they knew that this was likely to be a hiatus and not a long-term condition, right? So most of them were thinking ahead to the point of when the market starts picking up again, they're going to need all these people which they sweated blood to get into the organization, were beginning to fit in the organization, and they certainly didn't want to let them go now, only to find that they needed them 6 months down the road. So it was an interesting sort of challenge for them, and I think this was the challenge that most of them seem to be talking about today. It's not how do we deal with the crisis, it's not we think, the talent war's gone away. It's much more how do we mitigate, this unfortunate set of circumstances where cash is tight, in preparation for the time when we think the market's going to pick back up again.
Do you think they might be a bit misguided, though, in thinking that the crisis is going to be short-lived?
Well, think about it. The data that's coming out from China is that, the decline in exports has finally stopped. I think that's the message that came out. And indeed, on a month-to-month basis, we're now looking at October. For the last 2 months, there's been a growth overall in exports. Why does this matter? Because China is a big economy, exports being a major part of their economy. It's a strong indicator of the fact that the economy is beginning to look up again. But if you look at overall growth rates, even through the crisis, India and China are going to show growth rates of between 6 and 8%, right? So to a large extent, and to that extent, I think economies and parts of economies that were dependent on these two large markets were relatively unscathed. I'm not saying that anybody escaped, but they were relatively unscathed. So they did have the luxury of saying to themselves, we need to focus much more on making sure that the platforms that we've spent a lot of time building, right? The talent platforms, the infrastructure platforms, the institutional platforms, all of which are dependent on people, that these things don't get, thoughtlessly weakened over this. So to answer your question simply, I don't think it's misguided.
But it's going to be something of a buyer's market, right? That companies should find it easier to find the talent if you've got a large pool of talent out there.
The answer to that is that there's talent and there's talent. You may be right. I mean, in places where people are fungible, right, in the jobs that they do, that there may suddenly be a pool of people available. In other places, I'm not sure that that's the case, with some few exceptions. Let's take financial services, right? So specifically in financial services, the picture is of a lot of people who used to be employed, in investment banking and other areas, who are now looking for opportunities, okay? But at the same time, you hear of examples, I certainly have heard of one, where one particular very large financial institution was looking to find a creative way of holding on to some of its key talent by, for example, sending them to an educational institution, keeping them occupied, and holding on to them for the time when the economy started picking up again. About 4 months ago, we hear from them that, sorry, we can't spare these people anymore because, activities started up so early. So these are anecdotal, admittedly. I think the overall picture is as yet, firming up. I think certainly in certain parts of the world, like for example the United States and Western Europe, you may indeed see a stabilization of economies at the expense of jobs. All of this is entirely possible. However, I think the situation Asia could conceivably be quite different. And it's a bet that people are making. And the bet is that the costs of having to build up again for the future are so high, right, that it might be worth their while holding on to some of the key talent that they have right now. And remember, I mean, they made out like bandits over the last 10 years, so they've got enough surpluses there to be able to, take a bet, to hedge their bets, if you like, over the next few months.
I think one suggestion by a commentator in the FT recently was that companies could look at hiring fresh grads who are going to be relatively cheap, and then use this period to train them up. And then
Yeah.
once the crisis is over, you're ready to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all, indeed, I read that article. I thought it was quite interesting. Interesting because if you go and talk to an HR practitioner, that HR practitioner is liable to say, has that commentator in FT ever run an HR department? Because that's not the way we think. I mean, one of the strongest comments that came out of China over the last decade has been, if you had a magic potion, right, that could shorten the time frame over which people who joined my corporation and were raw talent were up to a point where they were functional and effective in a global organization, we would pay millions for that. The problem is that it's mostly a process of socialization, it's a process of gradually building experience, it's a process of understanding context both within a certain geography and across a geography, it's understanding an institutional context, all of which is not necessarily a linear process. So if I'm a conservative HR manager who knows that the line often places demands on me at short notice, saying, I need X, right, and I need them yesterday. My response is liable to be, how do I make sure I've got this pool of people available? And remember, everybody's participating in this. It's not just HR. HR would not be able to do this unilaterally. It is the line, and indeed people up and down the line, who are arguing the most vociferously to holding on to the talent that they have.
What advice would you have for companies in the region in terms of keeping employees engaged, especially at this sort of time?
Yeah, I think that there's been some very interesting steps that are being taken by companies, particularly in this region, and these vary all the way from India to China and every country in between. The recognition has been that because of the sort of disjointed forms of development in different industries, for example, in India, the IT industry seems to be streets ahead of a lot of others. Some manufacturing, for example, pharmaceutical seems to be ahead of others. Similarly, in China, you'll see large-scale manufacturing ahead of a lot of service provision and so on and so forth. Because of this disjointed forms of development, it's created pools of people who have come out also in very disjointed sorts of ways, in the sense that there is not the uniformity in terms of aspirations, expectations, desires, etc., that people in more stable and advanced economies would have, right? So if you look at, and I'm generalizing, I'm admittedly generalizing, but if you look at large developed economies, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, there are broad similarities by age cohorts, right? So if people between the age of 25 and 35 behave broadly differently from people who are between the age of 45 and 55. And of course there are differences depending on position in the organization, but that's it. Those are if you use those broad segmentation criteria, you can really address a lot of the unique needs of people. It's not the case in Asia. People have much more diverse interests, desires, and aspirations from their belonging to an organization. So what I've seen, which I think is very, very interesting, is organizations are getting extremely sophisticated about how they segment, not the market, but their employees. And especially large organizations, what they're saying to themselves is that you can't paint all your employees with the same brush. They have different aspirations. Some of them want to see the world, others want to stay in one place, some people want to be educated, some people want opportunities through a diversity of experiences. You cannot address everybody the same way. And especially when you have the challenge which one of the organizations that I spoke to quite closely and observed quite closely over the course of the summit was Accenture in India, who have grown by 35% each year for the last 5 years. They've gone from being a 15,000 person organization to a 135,000 organization in a ridiculously small period of time. Well, when you grow at those sorts of rates, paradoxically, it's not by trying to treat people in the same way, but by trying to understand what the broad categories of people are in your organization and how you can design sets of policies that appeal to and attract these different groups of people that will ensure your success. And I think that's the big one for me. Segmentation of employees, thinking in a granular sense of what is it that's going to enthuse, motivate, and engage different groups of employees, and keep them committed to the organization.
And social responsibility is one way of doing that?
That is indeed one dimension. And again, I personally think the growth in attention to social responsibility by corporate organizations is being driven by multiple stakeholders. This is not something that they're doing through some discovery of morality or values or anything like that. It's just that there are very powerful stakeholders who are driving them in that direction. The first, of course, are customers, who are saying, in some cases, that we are willing to pay a little more for the products of organizations that we know are socially responsible. The second, indeed, are employees who are saying our engagement with organizations who demonstrate social responsibility is likely to be higher than in those that don't.
One of the main challenges for companies in the region seems to be job hopping. It seems to be,
Yes.
having worked in Europe, having worked in Asia, it seems a major problem here.
Yep.
People change jobs very
Yep.
frequently.
It's a kid in a candy store, right? I mean, you think about the average employed person today who's working either for a multinational or regional organization today in Asia. This individual has opportunities that his or her parents never had, right? Most countries, well, certainly if you take India and China, the parents of today's workforce probably worked in government organizations, joined a particular job, didn't have, I mean, they relied on their pensions, for their retirement, and they didn't know, there was not much diversity nor hope for great, tremendous change in their lives. Their children today are faced with a set of opportunities like none they've seen before. And so quite naturally, the fear of missing out is just huge. However, you are seeing signs that this is, sort of calming down. It's a little bit like in developed economies, when people found that their basic needs were taken care of, so health care, retirement, children's education, all of this was done. Then they started thinking about, so what else is there? And I think that's what's happening to people today, even in Asia. They're beginning to discover that, okay, so my competencies mean that I'm going to have a fairly decent life. What's next? And that presumably will then drive also a little more thought about why should I engage with this organization, not another? What are some of the attributes that make that engagement worth my while, and so on.
Narayan Pant, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.